The concordance does not send warriors to collect compliance. It sends me. That distinction matters. I want you to understand it before I tell you the rest. Because everything that followed depended on the Veth Concordance's foundational belief that the archive is the weapon, that the signed form is the blade, and that a species which has returned correct filings for 11 consecutive years has already surrendered, even if no one told them that. Yet, warriors are expensive. Warriors imply the possibility of contest. The concordance has not needed warriors in 40,000 years. And the reason for that, the reason I believed, the reason every arbiter believes on the morning of a compliance deployment, is that no species has ever made us need them. I am first compliance arbiter Savoreth of the Veth Concordance. My rank has no military equivalent because there is no military equivalent. I carry a certification seal, a treaty ledger node, and the full backing of 40,000 years of unbroken galactic law. I have conducted compliance proceedings for 31 species on behalf of the concordance. Some cried. Some made speeches about sovereignty that the archive had already recorded and categorized under Subclause 7, Section 19. Jurisdictional protest, cosmetic, no effect on outcome. One species sent a delegation that sang a farewell hymn to their own independence for 6 uninterrupted hours. I logged the duration. I filed the compliance report. The outcome was the same. That is what I expected when I boarded. Threshold Vethnawar. Took my position at the compliance station. I want to tell you that I had misgivings. Looking back, I want to find some moment of instinct, some small tremor in my confidence as the station oriented toward Earth's orbital shelf, some professional hesitation that would let me say, I knew. I did not know. I had read the Earth file the way I read every file, with the practiced eye of someone who has already decided what the document is, before the first line renders. Earth, designation sole tertiary, had been a minor compliance case since the initial filing 11 years prior. They had been awarded provisional observer status under Article 14 of the Concordance Expansion Charter, entitled the Concordance to begin the integration process, and entitled Earth to continue operating independently for a period not to exceed 12 years, after which full compliance was mandatory and non-negotiable under treaty law. They had signed. Their representative, a woman named Consul General Adeze Oforiwa, a title our translator gave as something between administrative governor and senior diplomat, had reviewed the charter for 41 days, asked 17 clarifying questions through the correct submission channels, received 17 answers, and then signed. The signing protocol used the correct seal weight, the correct placement, and the correct form number. It was, by the standards of 31 prior proceedings, exemplary. Several of my colleagues had noted Earth's compliance behavior in the years since as a model for how new signatories should conduct themselves. Clean returns, on-time submissions, correct seal weight every time. There is a technical term in the Concordance lexicon for a species that cooperates this fully in its own absorption. Velith so. Roughly translated as cooperative absorption candidate. It is not pejorative. It is simply accurate. This understands the geometry of the situation, accepts the scale differential between itself and the concordance, and chooses smooth integration over futile resistance. Velith so species historically retain the most autonomy in the final compliance arrangement. They have the most leverage counterintuitively because they cost the concordance nothing. Earth was Velith so. My file said so. I had read the assessment on the transit to the station, noted it, and spent the remainder of the journey reviewing the compliance ceremony format, which runs 47 steps and takes roughly 4 hours when the signing party arrives on time. I expected the signing party to arrive on time. Based on 11 years of on-time filings, I would have been surprised by anything else. Threshold Vethnawar is a concordance treaty platform. A deep space compliance station, treaty mandated to be positioned at close approach range for the final compliance ceremony. Approach range is defined in the charter as within 40,000 standard units of the signatory's primary inhabited body. This requirement exists because the concordance learned, many thousands of years ago, that species which signed compliance documents at great distance have a higher rate of subsequent ambiguity about what they signed. Close approach eliminates ambiguity. The signatory sees the station. The signatory understands that the station is not a threat. It is an administrative facility, but they also understand viscerally what close approach means. The concordance finds this understanding clarifying. I arrived aboard the station at the start of the compliance window, took my position at the primary arbitration table, activated my certification node, and began the standard pre-ceremony diagnostic. The station crew, 12 VETH administrative staff and 2 technical specialists, completed their own checks. The close approach trajectory was confirmed. The station moved into position above Earth's orbital shelf, 89 degrees above the ecliptic, at a range of 38,200 standard units. Well within specification, the scanner ran its mandatory pre-ceremony sweep. I want to be precise about what happens during a mandatory pre-ceremony sweep because the details matter. Under concordance protocol, the scanner must complete a full local space inventory within a radius of 50 zero-zone standard units before the signing party is admitted to the compliance station. The purpose is administrative. We log the signatories' military and civilian assets as they exist at the moment of signing, establishes the baseline for the integration inventory. Ships, stations, defensive platforms, armed vessels, all are cataloged, their configuration recorded, their armament classifications noted. This is routine. Every species has ships. Most of them have some number of armed ships. The catalog tells the concordance what the integration will require, logistically, in the years after compliance. It is not a threat assessment. We do not conduct threat assessments. We conduct inventories. The scanner ran. I was reviewing the ceremony agenda, Section 3, Subclause F, the formal exchange of the compliance seal, when the scanner finished and filed its results to my station node. I remember the specific tone the node uses when it files a result, a low, even chime, familiar. Hundreds of times, that sound, and always followed by the kind of routine inventory that I could review in 4 minutes and set aside. I pulled the result open. The first anomaly I noticed was the count. The concordance's preliminary file on Earth's military capacity, assembled from observation data, public transmissions, from the materials Earth had itself submitted with their Article 14 application, noted a human military fleet of between 40 and 80 armed vessels depending on classification. Most were small. None exceeded Concordance Category 4 in hull mass, which is the threshold below which the integration inventory uses the simplified form rather than the full armament catalog. Its fleet had been assessed preliminarily as Category 3 or lower across the board. Simple form. Under my arm, figuratively speaking, handled as a footnote, the scanner showed 400 hulls. I stared at that number for a long time. Not because I doubted the scanner. The threshold VETH Naor. Scan array is the most precise instrument class the concordance fields on compliance deployments. It does not miscount. I stared because the number was not a number the file had prepared me for. And the first thing a trained arbiter does, when confronted with a discrepancy, is look for the administrative explanation. Perhaps the count included civilian transports. Some configuration of Earth's commercial fleet had been logged by the scanner under an armed vessel classification by error. Perhaps there had been a sensor return artifact, some reflective debris field near the orbital shelf. Doubling or tripling a reading, looked for the error. The scanner, obligingly, broke the count down by hull classification. There were no civilian hulls in the 15400. The scan array had separated them. Earth's commercial and passenger fleet, its scientific vessels, its orbital infrastructure, and set them aside. 15400 were all military, all armed, all, per the scan, actively powered. Not on standby, not in maintenance docking, powered with weapon systems in what the Concordance's own classification schema, which I was using for the scan readout, described as warm readiness. Not active targeting, not weapons-free, warm. The distinction is, I now understand, extremely precise. Warm readiness means we can fire in the time it takes you to finish one breath. Then the hull mass readings resolved. The Concordance uses 7 hull categories, 1 through 7, with 7 being the largest documented alien vessel class in the archive, a category that in 40,000 years of recorded compliance proceedings, has appeared exactly 9 times across all contact files, and which the Concordance's strategic doctrine notes in a single dry annotation. Category 7 contact. Refer to senior arbitration tier for manual review. 43 of the 1E400 hulls returned a Category 6 reading. The Concordance's archive contained no Category 6 hull from Earth's prior observation files. The preliminary assessment had assigned Earth's entire military capacity at Category 3 or below. The discrepancy between Category 3 and Category 6 is not a rounding error. It is not an ambiguity in classification. A Category 3 hull is an armed patrol vessel. A Category 6 hull is a deep-line cruiser, the class of ship a Concordance member state would describe, if it maintained such vessels at all, as a strategic deterrent. Category 6 is the hull class that, in the Concordance's own doctrine, the fee terminates. Veleth so. Designation and triggers a full armament review before any compliance proceedings may continue. I did not continue. I pulled the compliance ceremony file off the active queue. My hands were doing this before my thinking caught up. Trained habit. The moment a procedural block condition is met, you halt the queue. You don't think about it, you halt. I halted the queue, activated the communication channel to the Concordance's nearest relay station, and began composing an advisory notice. Is the formal document. An arbiter files when pre-ceremony conditions require review. I had written 3 lines of the advisory when the station crew spoke. Arbiter say Voreth. The voice belonged to Senior Technical Specialist Oreth Dayan, who managed the scan array. He had been quiet since the scan filed. I turned. He was looking at his secondary display, not at me. The lead hull, the one at bearing .4 above the orbital shelf. It has moved. Moved how? It has moved to approach orientation. Relative bearing to this station. It is at. He paused, rechecking the figure. 11, 0 standard units and closing. The mandatory close approach range, as I mentioned, was 38,200 standard units. Threshold Veth Naor was already inside that envelope. The approaching hull was now at 11,000 and closing. That was not the signing party's shuttle. A shuttle does not have a hull mass that causes the scan array to report. As I was now reading in the refreshed data, a Category 7 reading. The Category 7 had been behind the 43 Category 6 hulls. The scan array had resolved at last because its return signature was partially masked by the hulls arrayed in front of it. When those hulls shifted formation, which they had, scan now showed a shift of less than 3 degrees. A reorientation barely perceptible at this range. The masking failed, and the lead hulls' return signature reached the array. Fulton 400 hulls, 43 Category 6. 1 Category 7. I had never seen a Category 7 in any prior compliance proceeding. I had, in my training, reviewed the archive's 9 documented Category 8 contacts. I knew what the annotation said. I was now looking at the live scan of one of them resolving its DLs into my station node in real time, and I understood. With a certainty that arrived not through reasoning, but through the part of the mind that handles unambiguous physical fact, that I was not going to complete the compliance ceremony today. What is it called? I said. This was not a professional question. I was not sure what kind of question it was. But the station's translation node had been processing Earth's communications traffic for 11 years. Full archive of their public broadcasts was logged and catalogized. And I needed something to call the thing that was now 400 standard units away and growing on my viewport screen. Specialist Oreth Dayan checked the translation node. The human designation for the hull class is Deep Battle Cruiser, he said. The specific vessel, the individual ship, is designated Unbroken Meridian. Fleet formation is designated the Ashvael Compact. Oreth Dayan said the words as flat data. He read them the way a specialist reads instrument output. I felt each one land with a weight that had nothing to do with their translation. Ashvael Compact, the Unbroken Meridian. These were not words in our archive. They were not in the Earth file. They were not in the 11 years of filings, the 17 clarifying questions, the 41 days of review before the signature, the impeccable on-time seal returns. They were nowhere in any document Earth had ever submitted to the concordance. That was the moment I understood the structure of what had happened. Not all of it. The full structure would take days to reconstruct. And some of it I am not certain I have right even now, but the shape of it. The shape was this. Earth had been given 12 years under Article 14. Earth had used 11 of those years correctly, precisely, and without a single compliance deficiency. The filings were real. The seals were correct. The questions had been asked in good faith, or at least in the grammatical form of good faith. And while all of that was happening, while every return filing had been on time, every seal weight correct, every form number accurate, someone had been building a Category 7 hull. The unbroken Meridian was not new. The scan data, as it continued resolving, was providing age estimates from the reactor profile and the hull material return, and the numbers it was producing were not consistent with a ship that had been built in 11 years. The minimum estimate the scanner returned, which I noted carefully and which I have thought about many times since, was 63 years. The ship was at least 63 years old. Some internal components registered older. The reactor core returned an age estimate of 91 years. The hull plating in the forward sections was newer. Replacement plating, the scan suggested, installed in sections over time, but the core of the ship was old. Unbroken Meridian had not been built in response to the concordance's filing. It had existed before the filing. It had been there, somewhere in Earth's system or its near space, for at least 60 years before a single form was submitted. I held this fact in my attention for some time. There is a specific sick sensation I associate with the moment when a filing I thought I understood turns to be something else entirely. Not a physical sensation, but something close to it. An internal recalibration, a resorting. I had experienced it 22 times in 31 compliance proceedings, always over much smaller discrepancies. A species that had understated its population. A resource inventory that had omitted a secondary colony. Honest errors, most of them. Occasionally deliberate omissions. The recalibration in those cases was minor. A notation in the file, a corrected form. This was not a notation. I want to describe the experience precisely because I think it matters for any arbiter who reads this account later. Training program for concordance compliance work is thorough. It is 3 years of intensive preparation, followed by a supervised apprenticeship, followed by a minimum of 5 solo-SU deployments before an arbiter is granted the first compliance designation. During that training, you develop what I can only describe as an administrative vocabulary for reality. Everything that happens during a compliance proceeding passes through that vocabulary first. A species objects, Subclause 7, Section 19, Jurisdictional Protest Cosmetic. A species provides incomplete inventory, Form 34C, Resource Inventory Correction, submit within the grace period. A species requires additional clarification time. Article 14 Provisional Extension, conditions apply. The vocabulary is comprehensive. It was built from 40,000 years of precedent. And in those 40,000 years, concordance has encountered enough variety, weeping species, singing species, species that went silent, and species that made noise that registered as threats until the translation node resolved it as grief. That the vocabulary developed entries for nearly everything. The training teaches you to trust it. When you stop trusting it, the thinking goes, stop being an arbiter and start being something more like a combatant, and the concordance does not send combatants to collect compliance. Sitting in the compliance station, watching the scan data continue to resolve on my node, I noticed that my administrative vocabulary was failing me with a completeness I had never experienced before. Not failing in the sense of reaching the edge of its definitions. Every filing I had ever processed had eventually fit somewhere in the catalog, even the unusual ones. Failing in the sense of being structurally irrelevant to what was in front of me. The vocabulary was built to describe the relationship between the concordance and a species that understood it was a signatory. The vocabulary did not have a section for a species that had signed the document while already possessing, for the better part of a century, physical means to decline. I sat with this for a long time. The scan array continued refreshing. The hull count did not change. The mass readings did not change. The warm readiness status across 400 hulls did not change. Outside the station's viewport, Earth's orbital shelf turned slowly below us, blue and white and unhurried. This was not a notation. The unbroken meridian filled my viewport. At 11,000 standard units, it had appeared on the visual feed as a dot, barely distinguishable from debris. At 7,000, it began to resolve into shape. At 4,000, I stopped looking at the instrument readings and looked at the image. The hull was not elegant. I want to note that specifically, because there is a kind of aesthetic assumption that very powerful things will be beautiful, that the archive will describe them in terms of grace and proportion, that the scanner will translate their dimensions into something that feels inevitable and correct. Scram. Unbroken meridian was not beautiful. It was enormous and it was scarred, and it was dense in a way that the viewport rendering could not entirely capture, but that scan data translated into hull mass figures that required me to check the readout unit conversion twice. The plating was mismatched across the forward sections. Replacement panels in different surface finishes, some darker, some showing older oxidation patterns, some newer and therefore slightly lighter in tone, giving the bow a patchwork quality that suggested long history and repeated repair. Scoring marks crossed the flanks in patterns that the Concordance's damage classification system tried to assign to known weapon types, and mostly failed. Several of the return signatures were not consistent with any weapon in the archive. I found myself doing something I do not normally do during a compliance proceeding, which is trying to read the ship the way you might try to read a document. Looking for what it was saying about itself, rather than what the scan data was saying about it. What it said, studied this way, was age, not age as decay, age as accumulation. The hull had seen repairs so many times that the repairs had become part of its identity, layered into its surface the way the rings of a cross-section record decades. The forward section's patchwork plating told a history of impacts taken and answered and survived. The flanks told a history of weapons fired, close enough to leave scoring, which meant engagements of a kind the Concordance's compliance archive did not, by design, collect data on. The data we collected was inventories and filings. The data written on the hull of the unbroken meridian. Something else. Specialist Orith Dayan spoke from his station. Hull scoring on the port forward quarter. I've been trying to match it to the weapon type catalog. He paused. There are 11 distinct scoring patterns. 4 of them match known weapon types. The other 7, he stopped. The other 7, I said, don't match anything in the catalog. I looked at the image. 7 distinct weapon type signatures not in the Concordance's archive. The archive that had been built over 40,000 years. The archive into which the physical evidence of more than 1,800 compliance proceedings had been filed, categorized, and cross-referenced. The archive that the senior arbitration tier had reviewed on at least 2 prior occasions involving Category 7 contacts, and that had apparently emerged from those reviews with terms it kept sealed. The Concordance's catalog was, by any reasonable measure, the most comprehensive record of weapons technology in existence. It documented technologies from species long extinct and species still active, technologies recovered from wreck sites millennia old, and technologies observed in the field during recent proceedings. It had 7 empty slots, cut into the side of a single hull, in patterns the scoring analysis module had tried to resolve and returned. Unknown origin. I made a note in my log. The note read, scoring. 7 of 11 weapon signatures unmatched in catalog. I looked at it for a moment after I wrote it. It did not seem like a sufficient record of what I was feeling, but it was accurate, which is what a log entry is supposed to be. The ship's weapon mounts were visible at this range. The scan array's count gave a number I read 3 times, not because I doubted the sensor, because the number required a structural adjustment in how I was holding the situation in my mind, and I needed the repetition to complete it. The engines were lit, not warm, lit, full operational glow, the kind of light that the scan array translates as full motive readiness. The ship was not approaching on inertia. It was driving, controlled, precise, unhurried, but under power, its engine signature reading in a frequency band The Concordance's catalog listed as possible in theory but unconfirmed in practice. At 2 to FACE standard units it stopped. Not slowed and stopped, stopped. The transition from full motive readiness to zero relative motion registered on the scan as an event that lasted less than 8 seconds. The Concordance's own doctrine on momentum management for a hull of this mass class, the doctrine that we use for our own largest vessels, specified a deceleration envelope of no less than 40 minutes for a controlled stop from the speed this ship had been maintaining, the unbroken meridian. Did it in 8 seconds. The scan array filed a sensor confidence warning because the deceleration figure exceeded the instrument's modeled maximum, any hull of this mass. I cleared the warning. The instrument was correct. The hull had simply done something the instrument had been designed to assume was impossible. It sat there. 2,000 standard units. Close enough that the visual feed showed the individual panel seams on the bow section. Close enough that the weapon arrays were no longer the abstract count figures from the scan data, but visible, real. Long rows of them along the flanks, some partially recessed, most not, and all of them oriented, I noticed, not toward threshold Veth Naor, but in vectors pointing outward, covering the angles of approach from every direction except the one directly behind the unbroken meridian. That angle, the direction the ship had come from, was covered by the 43 Category 6 hulls, which had repositioned while I was watching the unbroken meridian approach and now sat in a rearguard formation that I could only describe, applying the Concordance's own strategic geometry terminology, as a perfect enclosure. Threshold Veth Naor was inside the enclosure. It had been inside the enclosure, I realized, since before I noticed the first hull count discrepancy. Formation had not moved to encircle us. We had moved into it, on schedule, on the compliance trajectory, into a space that the Ashvael compact had prepared and then weighted in. The scan data, re-examined in light of this, showed the outer hulls as having been on station, not moving, not repositioning, simply waiting, for a period the scan array estimated at somewhere between 4 and 11 days. The range of the estimate was wide because the hulls had been running at very low emission profiles, not completely cold. That the standard approach scan, performed at a range of 50,000 standard units, would have returned them below the threshold for confident identification. At 38,000 standard units, the mandatory close approach range, profiles had risen just above threshold. The 1400 hulls had been sitting, at low emission, inside the mandatory close approach envelope, up to 11 days. They had been there when the compliance window opened. They had been there when threshold Veth Naor entered its approach trajectory. They had been there when I was reviewing the ceremony agenda on the transit, Section 3, Subclause F, the formal exchange of the compliance seal. The communication channel opened. The voice was human. I had reviewed enough of Earth's public broadcast archive to recognize the cadence of their speech even in translation, particular rhythm of a voice that has been trained for formal address. This voice had that quality. Measured, unhurried. The same tone, I thought, that the 17 clarifying questions had been submitted in. The same register as 11 years of on-time filings. First compliance, Arbiter Savorth. Good morning. My name is Consul General HFY. I believe you have my signature on file. I found my voice. It required a deliberate effort. I do, I said. Excellent. I want to begin by confirming that every filing Earth has submitted to the Veth Concordance over the past 11 years has been accurate, complete, and submitted within the required window. I am prepared to certify this again, in whatever format your ceremony requires. Certification node was still open. I had halted the compliance queue. I was aware, distantly, that the formal response to this opening statement was a specific acknowledgement phrase from Section 1 of the ceremony format. I did not use it. Consul General, I said, I am looking at a scan return showing 1,400 armed hulls in the surrounding space, including 43 vessels of a hull class not present in any prior Earth inventory submission, and one vessel whose hull mass and armament classification exceeds anything in the Concordance's compliance archive. I am at a loss to reconcile this with the preliminary assessment file. There was a pause, not long. The kind of pause a person takes when they are deciding not on what to say, but on how to say something they have clearly already decided. We were aware, Consul General Aforowa said, that the preliminary assessment file was incomplete. We noted the discrepancy when we reviewed the Article 14 documentation during the 41-day review period. We submitted 17 clarifying questions. None of them addressed the discrepancy we interpreted as indicating the Concordance had not identified it. I processed this. You identified the error in the Concordance's preliminary assessment 11 years ago. We identified an omission, yes. The Concordance's file did not include several vessel classes that were already operational at the time of the initial filing. We were not asked to correct it. The Article 14 documentation does not require the signatory to correct errors in the Concordance's own inventory. Requires the signatory to return accurate filings in response to Concordance queries. We have done that. Every filing we have returned has been accurate and complete with respect to the query as asked. I looked at the file. She was right. The Concordance's queries, the 11 years of inventory and status submissions, Earth had been asked to return, had asked about specific categories: vessel, commercial fleet, orbital infrastructure, orbital Chelsea vessels below a specified mass threshold. Earth had returned complete and accurate information on every category queried. Concordance had not thought to query the categories above the mass threshold. The preliminary assessment had assigned Earth a maximum hull class of Category 3. The query forms used that assessment as their ceiling. We had never asked about Category 4. We had never asked about Category 5, 6, or 7. Queries had been designed on the assumption that the ceiling was correct. The Ashvael Compact, I said. The words felt strange. Like pronouncing a name you had been told was fictional and discovering it is not. How long? Another pause. This one felt considered, as if she were choosing between truthful and fully truthful. The compact has been in its current configuration for 19 years, she said. The unbroken Meridian has been in continuous service for 63. The hull you are looking at is its 7th major refit. The core structure is 91 years old. We have records if you'd like them. We've maintained them carefully. 19 years. The Concordance had filed its Article 14 Provisional Observer Notice 11 years ago. The Ashvael Compact, in its current configuration, predated the filing by 8 years. Unbroken Meridian, in its core structure, predated it by 80 years. Earth had signed a compliance charter with a treaty organization that was categorically entirely unaware of what it was signing a charter with. The 41 days of review, the 17 clarifying questions, the exemplary filings, correct seal weights. Velith Soa. I had called it cooperative absorption candidate, the species that understands the geometry of the situation, thought. Sitting in the compliance station at the center of a formation of 4,400 hulls, that I had badly misread, who understood the geometry. Consul General, I said, I need to understand something. You returned every filing. You attended this proceeding. You have. I paused, because the language was not cooperating with what I needed to say. You have appeared for 11 years, to be preparing for compliance. We have been preparing, she said, to have this conversation. We wanted to have it in person. I looked at the viewport. Unbroken Meridian. Sat at 2,000 standard units, lit and still, and enormous. The 43 Category 6 hulls were arranged beyond it at varying distances, formation whose geometry I recognized as matching no concordance tactical classification, but which communicated without ambiguity everything it needed to communicate. Behind. Threshold Veth Naor. Somewhere in the envelope the remaining 1C356 hulls waited at warm readiness. The Veth Concordance, I said carefully, 40,000 years of compliance history. No species has refused a filing. We are not refusing, Consul General Offerwa said. We want to negotiate. That word sat in the channel like something that had been thrown from a great height and landed. The Concordance does not negotiate. There is no protocol for it. The treaty charter does not include a mechanism for it. 40,000 years of compliance proceedings, 1,847 species, dozens of them larger than Earth, dozens of them older, several of them with more significant military capacity than anything the preliminary assessment had suggested Earth possessed. Not one of them had used that word in a compliance channel. The word existed in the archive as a historical curiosity, the kind of concept that species from the pre-concordance era had practiced before the archive made it unnecessary. You negotiate when the outcome is uncertain. The concordance's outcomes have not been uncertain. The silence on the channel lasted longer than I intended. Consul General Oforiwa let it run. She did not fill it. I noted that. The patience of someone who has made a statement and is willing to wait for it to land, rather than immediately qualifying it. I want to be direct, I said at last, because directness is something my training prizes above many things, and it seemed, sitting inside a formation of 14,400 armed hulls, like the right tool. The concordance does not have a mechanism for negotiation. The Article 14 Charter outlines a compliance pathway. There is not an alternative track. We know, she said. We read the Charter very carefully, 1 days carefully. Another pause. We think the Charter needs a mechanism. That is not a determination an arbiter can make. No, she agreed. But it is a determination the senior arbitration tier can make. We would like the opportunity to make our case to the senior tier person, with full representation. We've been preparing the materials for 11 years, and we believe the case is worth hearing. I sat with this. The materials, 11 years of materials, every filing returned on time, every seal correct, every form numbered accurately, and alongside it, a fleet that the archive had no category for, assembled in patient formation around the one station I had arrived at, waiting for me to complete a scan that would leave me no procedural option but to escalate. The 17 clarifying questions asked through correct submission channels, the 41 days of review before the signature, the 9 years of impeccable compliance behavior after. All of it had been materials. All of it had been preparation for this specific conversation. They had been working toward this moment since before the filing was made. What terms, I said. Not because I had the authority to hear them. Because I had been in the compliance station for 3 hours, and the unbroken meridian, 2,000 standard units away, and Consul General Oforiwa sounded like a person who had been waiting a long time to say what she was about to say, and I had concluded that I was going to hear it, whether I asked or not. She took a breath. I could hear it in the channel, the slight catch of a long-held moment finally beginning. Mutual recognition, she said, recognizes the concordance as the dominant administrative authority in this region of space. The concordance recognizes Earth and the Ashvael Compact as a sovereign military entity operating under Earth's authorization. No integration inventory, no compliance schedule, bilateral trade access under Article 22 of the Concord Expansion Charter, the commercial partner provisions, observer status converted to associate membership. No seats on the governing council. We're not asking for that. We are asking to be treated as what we are. I pulled up Article 22 on my node. The commercial partner provisions were written for member states that had client relationships with species outside the compliance framework. They were not as written, a pathway that a pending compliance signatory could invoke. But they had been written 40,000 years ago, conditions that had not, until this moment, included a pending compliance signatory with 400 hulls and a Category 7 deep battle cruiser making the request. You understand that I cannot accept these terms, I said. I understand you cannot accept them today, she said. I'm asking you to convey them. Another pause. Shorter this time, because the conversation had arrived at the place it had been moving toward and both of us knew it. I will convey them, I said. Thank you. She said it simply. Without relief. Not the way someone says it when they have gotten what they wanted, but the way someone says it when the first step of a long process has been completed correctly. The channel closed. I sat in the compliance station for a long time after that. The scan array continued running, because it is designed to run continuously during a compliance window, and its data continued refreshing on my node. The unbroken meridian did not move. The outer hulls did not move. Threshold Veth Naor did not move. The orbital shelf of Earth was visible in the viewport below the station, blue and white and distant, the planet that had been, according to the file I had read on my transit, a minor compliance case, a Velith-SOA candidate, a species that understood the geometry. In the hours between the closing of the channel and the point at which I began composing my advisory notice, I reviewed the Earth file again, not the part I had read on the transit. The current SIS section, the filing history, the compliance assessment, the early sections, the initial contact documentation. The exploration observations made before the concordance approached Earth with the Article 14 offer. The observations were 14 years old. They had been conducted by a concordance survey team operating under standard first contact observation protocols, which require at minimum a 6-month observation period before an Article 14 filing is appropriate. The survey team had observed Earth for 8 months and had filed their assessment, formed the basis of the preliminary data I had been working from. The assessment was thorough in the ways. Concordance surveys are always thorough: population estimate, territorial range, primary resource base, political organization overview, existing technology level, military capacity estimate. I read the military capacity section with a focus I had not given it on the transit. The survey team had noted Earth's surface-based military activity. They had noted orbital installations. They had noted a number of armed vessels consistent with the preliminary assessment I had relied on. What they had not noted, what they had, looking back, spectacularly failed to note, was that their observation period of 8 months had covered a range of roughly 200 Theozen standard units around Earth. The Ashvael Compact's documented operational range was larger than that. Several of the Category 6 hulls ID signatures, when I cross-checked them against the scan data's registration estimates, turned service histories, suggesting they had been in operation for longer than 8 months at the time the survey was conducted. The survey team had observed Earth. They had not observed Earth's full operational range. The survey's coverage radius had been the standard radius. The standard radius had been determined 40,000 years ago, at a time when the most distant military asset any observed species had fielded was fraction of the Ashvael Compact's apparent operational reach. This was the administrative vocabulary failing again. Not because the survey had been conducted incorrectly, because correctly was a definition built on precedent, and the precedent had not included this. I made another note. It said, "Survey coverage radius requires review for future first contact assessments." Then I closed the file and began the advisory notice. I filed my advisory notice to the concordance relay that evening. I was careful about language, trained to be careful about language. It is the primary professional skill of an arbiter. But I was more careful than usual, because I understood that the notice I was filing was going to be read by people who had, like me, read Earth's file and formed a view of what Earth was. And I was going to have to revise that view, using only the tools of administrative prose. The Category 7 hull I wrote had been in service for 63 years minimum and 91 years at its core structure. I wrote it twice, in slightly different phrasing, to make sure it landed. The Ashvael Compact, in its current configuration, dated the concordance filing by 8 years. The preliminary assessment error was our own. The signatory had maintained full filing compliance throughout. The signatory had requested negotiation. I filed the advisory. I recommended suspension of the compliance proceeding pending senior arbitration review. I recommended, in a separate section marked with the formal header, arbiter discretionary opinion, non-binding, that the senior tier review the query methodology used in Article 14 proceedings. Before deploying a second compliance team, the wording I used was careful and technical. What it meant, in plain language, was, check what you are asking before you assume the answer. I received an acknowledgement from the relay within 3 standard cycles. Standard acknowledgement language. No comment on content. The senior arbitration tier had been notified. Review would proceed. Then I waited. The Concordance's senior arbitration tier reviewed my advisory for 17 days. I was asked 2 clarifying questions during that period, both of them about the scan data methodology. I answered both. On the 18th day, I received a decision notice. Compliance proceeding was suspended, as I had recommended. The negotiation request was declined. A second compliance team had been authorized and dispatched. With a reinforced concordance enforcement presence, the notice used the word reinforced, without specifying what had been added to the standard compliance deployment, and I found myself reading that word carefully, with the memory of the unbroken meridian, sitting at 2,000 standard units still very present. I thought about what reinforced meant against 43 Category 6 hulls and 1 Category 7. I thought about the 19-year configuration of the Ashvael compact. I thought about the query methodology the notice did not mention revising. The notice also included as a footnote a corrected preliminary assessment for Earth. The hull count figures had been updated to reflect the scan data I had filed. The maximum hull classification had been revised from Category 3 to Category 7. Category 7 contact, the doctrine annotation read, refer to senior arbitration tier for manual review. The annotation said nothing about what you were supposed to do after you had already sent the senior arbitration tier. I returned to Concordance Central with threshold Veth Naur. Standard transit. The journey took 41 days. I spent some of it reviewing the archive, not the Earth file, that had been updated, and the updated version was, I felt, still incomplete in ways that would take longer than the transit to articulate. I reviewed other files, old compliance proceedings, the history of the archive, the documentation of the 9 prior Category 7 contacts. 7 of those 9 had involved species that no longer existed in any form the archive could confirm. The file notes for those 7 were sparse. Compliance achieved. Some of them read, others were less clear. A few had entries that ended mid-sentence, as if the arbiter had been composing the report when something interrupted them. I read the incomplete entries carefully and tried not to draw conclusions about why they were incomplete, because the conclusions available were limited and none of them were comfortable. 2 of the 9 Category 7 contacts were labeled differently. Not compliance achieved. Both of those entries read, matter referred to senior tier, and then went silent for several decades of archive time before resuming with a notation that read, bilateral arrangement concluded. Terms confidential under senior tier authority, file sealed. I read those 2 entries carefully. I read them several times. The file dates matched historical periods I knew from other contexts, long periods of stability in the Concordance's expansion periods, when the pace of compliance proceedings had slowed, for reasons the archive described as administrative but which, rereading them now with different eyes, I was not sure were entirely administrative. The slowdowns in those periods had lasted, by my calculation, between 17 and 34 years each, long enough to be described as periods of consolidation. Long enough, if you chose to read them differently, to describe negotiations of a certain scope and weight. I also noted, on careful reading of the surrounding archive entries, that neither of the 2 species involved in those bilateral arrangements appeared in any subsequent compliance proceeding as a signatory or as a pending integration. They appeared instead in trade route references and in commercial partner notations under Article 22, precise provisions that Consul General Oforiwa had cited. I sat with that for several days of the transit. The archive had seen this before. Not often, not clearly, the sealed terms made clarity impossible, but the shape was there, feel, if you looked at the surrounding material and were willing to read the silence between the entries. Twice in 40,000 years, the Concordance had encountered something at the Category 7 level and had emerged from the encounter with a bilateral arrangement instead of a compliance filing. Twice in 40,000 years, and now Earth, with Article 22 specifically cited, and 11 years of impeccable compliance, behavior as the context for a request that the senior tier hear their case in person, with materials prepared over that same 11-year period, with a fleet of 1,400 hulls, providing the visual argument that the archive could not. I filed a request to access the sealed terms of both historical bilateral arrangements. The archive returned a standard access denial notice, sealed under senior tier authority. Arbiter rank insufficient for access. I noted the denial in my personal log and returned to reviewing. But I also noted, in the same log entry, that the sealed terms were sealed rather than destroyed. They existed in the archive. Someone had kept them. The concordance keeps things it may need to reference again. On the 31st day of the transit, I received a brief communication from a relay station. Administrative inform. A status update, the kind that compliance arbiters receive when cases they have filed are progressing. The second compliance team had departed for Earth on schedule. The enforcement presence had been confirmed as dispatched. Expected arrival at Earth's orbital shelf, 44 days from dispatch. Status, in transit. I noted it. I continued the journey. I arrived at Concordance Central 8 days before the second compliance team's expected arrival at. I filed my full preading report, the complete account of the advisory, the scan data, the conversation with Consul General HFY, the formation geometry, the unbroken meridian, the age estimates, the Ashvael Compact's 19-year configuration. The report was long. I had been careful with it. The processing arbiter who received my report acknowledged it in the standard form and told me I would be reassigned to a new proceeding within 12 days. The 44-day window for the second compliance team's arrival at Earth passed. No status update arrived. This is not by itself unusual. Transit communications have delays. Compliance proceedings can run long. The 44-day estimate had been that, an estimate. I did not begin to find the silence notable until 60 days had passed. Then 70, I filed a status query on day 71. Standard form. Administrative language. The kind of query any arbiter would file when a referred case goes beyond estimated duration without update. The archive returned an acknowledgement. My query was received. Response pending. The response did not come. On day 91, I filed a second query. This one I marked with a formal header. Arbiter escalation request, which elevates the query to the attention of a senior processing arbiter. I received an acknowledgement. Response pending. I am writing this record on day 114. No response has come. The second compliance team's case status in the archive reads active, in transit, which is the status it has held since the day it departed. The archive has not been updated. The file has not been sealed. There is no entry for compliance achieved. Is no entry for matter referred to senior tier. There is no entry of any kind. I have reviewed the two historical bilateral arrangements again, the two sealed files. I have read their surrounding context more carefully this time. The years before the arrangements, the compliance proceedings in neighboring regions, pace of expansion. I have read everything the unsealed portions of the archive tell me about those two periods. The concordance does not negotiate. In 40,000 years it has not needed to. The archive is the weapon. The signed form is the blade. And a species which cooperates with the process, which returns every filing correctly, which asks 17 clarifying questions and then signs. That species has demonstrated, beyond any professional doubt, that it understands the geometry. I am beginning to think the geometry was ours to misread. On my desk there is a single document, a physical copy, which I printed. Because the archiving system has been intermittently unavailable, for administrative reasons the processing office has not clarified. It is Consul General HFY's original signature on the Article 14 Compliance Charter. The seal weight is correct. The form number is accurate. Placement is precise to within 2/10 of the required standard. Below the signature, in the space the form designates for optional signatory notes, a space that no species in 1112 compliance proceedings has ever used. There is a single line of text in the human script that our translator renders as, "We look forward to the in-person meeting." I have not heard from the second compliance team. I am not certain I expect to. The archive has a category for everything that has ever been encountered in 40,000 years of concordance expansion. It was built to hold all of it. Every species and every ship and every signed form and every outcome. It is the most complete record of galactic civilization in existence. I spent 11 years reading an Earth file that fit neatly inside it. The unbroken meridian does not fit inside it. I am not sure what fits inside it anymore. I am not sure the archive is big enough. I am not sure it was ever meant to be. I filed my withdrawal recommendation. The senior tier declined it. I am waiting for the archive to update. I am not certain it will.